Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight for our event. We are very excited to have Professor Carter here. We are looking forward to a very engaging and robust fireside chat. It's good to see all of the familiar faces. Tonight's discussion is Fighting for Justice, starts with From Within, a reflection on racial justice in our communities. We are very lucky tonight to have Professor Youssef Carter, who is in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is the Kenan Rifai Fellow in Islamic Studies, got his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. His research interests includes, but is not limited to, Sufism and Sufi movements, Islam in West Africa and the United States, religion in the African diaspora, Black Atlantic and decolonial studies, and the anthropology of religion. Professor Carter, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be amongst you and a pleasure to speak with you.
I think one of the great things is that we're all here. The fact that it is Black History Month and that there is a group of us from within the Ummah who thought it would be important to come here and discuss these issues and, frankly, how we can do better with racial justice in our communities, how within our country, as we've seen throughout the history, unfortunately, and maybe has been more amplified in the public realm to certain people that haven't been affected by it intimately through our recent past president, is the issue of anti-Blackness in our country. And unfortunately, because it does exist in our country, it does not escape our own communities. So we did share your essay, Critiquing Black Muslim Reason, What Good is Critical Race Theory for Muslims? And I think I would just start for that, maybe just kind of a real quick discussion about critical race theory. What is it good for?
Critical race theory. So it's essentially what is it good for is understanding the lived experiences and history of racialization of people who have been marginalized, particularly people of color, specifically Black people, people of African descent. In the context of the United States, in this case, but critical race theory is something that we can understand as a broad scholarly approach to understanding processes of racialization and othering and difference on a broad global scale, right? And how that operates to categorize human beings according to certain problematic understandings of value. And so the article that I wrote arises out of sort of witnessing this interaction amongst certain religious leaders in the United States, within the sort of American Muslim Ummah, as well as between these religious leaders and certain activists, or I guess media personalities who frankly called certain religious leaders out for their sort of conservative commentary, disparaging critical race theory, particularly in my opinion, without citation, but rather through provocation, right? That is, the religious leaders were disparaging critical race theory. Without an acute understanding of critical race theory's merits, right? Without an understanding of its sort of academic genealogy, without, I would say, a sort of a broader understanding of its role in helping the public, students, in sort of understanding these processes of racializations, particularly racialization, with the aim of understanding how our society is structured in such a manner that works to marginalize people based on race or ideas about race. And so while sort of witnessing this interaction and seeing these two groups sort of talk past each other, I took it as an opportunity to not just sort of critique what I saw as a provocation and a sort of non-scholarly approach masked as a scholarly opinion. I also wanted to clear the air or attempt to clear the air about how we can deploy critical race theory to understand anti-Muslimness, or i.e. Islamophobia, right? But also to offer more nuance in thinking about the varying ways in which people experience anti-Muslimness, right? As well as anti-Blackness, right? Because while a particular sort of whole swath of Muslims in the United States would agree that anti-Muslim violence, Islamophobia is a problem, right? There are aspects of the Muslim community that would agree, right, that inside of the American Muslim community, right, if we can talk about a singular community, which we probably cannot, that Muslims themselves have been guilty of varying kinds of discrimination and racist thought, particularly anti-Blackness. And so there's a way in which Muslims of African descent in the United States in particular, right, and are on the receiving end of anti-Black Islamophobia, right? All of that, or anti-Black, anti-Muslimness, right? So yeah, that was the spirit of that article.
Well, within the article, you talk about sort of the Muslim foundations for the academic way of knowing something versus the lived experience way of knowing something. It appears, sometimes in your article, there was a discussion about this idea that Black Muslims or the Black community are more aggressive. There was an aggressive way of going after the professors. And I think to a certain extent, it seems like critical race theory could help all of us understand that some of these notions are embedded into us by the established, way we speak in a white supremacist country, or with the underpinnings that we have. And then we could understand that, well, maybe that's not true. Maybe we can think about this a different way. It's not someone being aggressive. It's someone saying, hey, this is happening to me. It's unpleasant. It's not good. I am a fellow member of the faith. Can we talk about this? And it's hurtful.
Yeah, so two things, right? So as I was writing the article, right, I came to a certain realization, because it's kind of one of those things where you're, in the midst of writing, if anybody's sort of written things, which I'm sure you all have, it's a conversation you're having with yourself. You're trying to sort of work out, what am I trying to say? What does this mean? What am I trying to convey, right? So at the beginning of and for those of you that read it, I guess you can tell, but at the beginning of the article, I began talking, I talk about critical race theory and its usages and its usefulness. And then I kind of arrived to a point where I realized, I stopped myself and I said, hey, wait a second, right? An academic understanding of critical race theory does not necessarily root out the problem, right? I was having this conversation actually with my students today. I'm teaching a course on ethnicity, race, and religion in America. We talked about sort of Latinx communities, Latinx identities in the sort of religious context, right? So we looked at we talked about Latino Jews in the United States and Latino Muslims in the United States in order to think about the varying ways in which people sort of wear multiple identities. But anyway, people who are racist, right? There's two ways in which one can be racist, right? Racism can be animated by ignorance. It also can be animated by hatred, right? Sometimes these overlap. Often they do. Often one leads to the other. One aspect of that, one side of my mind tells me that, yes, there are people that certainly walk around with very problematic ideas about folks who they identify as different, right? And sort of undoing that and discouraging sort of racist thought could be a matter of education. And so that's a matter of sort of readings, discussion, dialogue, what have you. And then the other side of that is, there is absolutely in my mind, no way that you can um, have access to all the data that we have access to all of the scholarship that we have access to, generally speaking, have access to all of the media that we have access to, and still be convinced that one set of people are somehow naturally or organically inferior to you because of the skin that you were born in, or because of the place in the world that you were born in, or the sort of cultural norms that you ascribe to, right? Or that inform your everyday life, right? Um, I get to a place in that writing, in that process of writing, in that article, where I say, where I want to express the reality that your feelings aren't important. What's important here, right, are the fact that people are losing their lives, right? Um, through varying kinds of state-sanctioned violence, through varying kinds of sort of structural discrimination that weigh on and make life challenging, right? Suffocating, right? For certain people because of um, the color of their skin, right? Or their perceived difference, right? Um, yeah, so I feel like, and I was actually encouraged by the kind of interactions that I saw, because the alternative to that would be silence. The alternative to that engagement, however aggressive or polite or what have you, the alternative to that is disengagement. The alternative to that is a disinvestment, a stepping back, right? Um, uh, an unwillingness to dialogue, right? And a hardening of boundaries within a purportedly singular community, right? Um, and so that that prospect I found troubling, right? Um, it's we all, some of it, those of us who have siblings know that there's a point at which you fight with your siblings and you still love them at the end of the day. Unfortunately, some of us have are in families where people don't talk to each other and just don't interface with each other at all, and that represents a kind of a fracturing that in some cases can be insurmountable, right? And so yes, I would say that there's a fracture in what we might think of as the American Muslim public sphere, right? um, on one side we see Muslims who have uh, engaged in matters of social justice in order to alleviate their own oppression and to stretch the boundaries of what we understand as religious freedom, uh, in addition to racial justice in this country. And then we have another portion of uh, Muslims who have ascribed to a model minority approach, right, to uplift, right? Unfortunately, that model minority approach involves ascribing to certain problematic ideations about people who are not able to um, lift themselves up by their own bootstraps, right? Um, in defiance of physics. Never mind the requirement to own bootstraps in the first place, right? And so that this fracture, which we might sort of describe as a kind of like political or socio-political fracture, also represents, in my mind, almost a theological or quasi-theological fracture, right? That has implications for the very foundations of how we understand, or what we understand Islam to be, right? Um, do we understand Islam as a a pathway to our creator that involves establishing justice um, and um, harmony and human fraternity or sorority, right? Regardless of where you are? Or is it merely a set of practices and rituals that are empty of any sort of implication for societal sort of engagement? Um, I would not argue that that is the prophetic tradition. Um, I would not argue that that is the model for um, um, upright or righteous behavior, right? Righteous behavior isn't always, we shouldn't conflate righteous behavior with politeness, right? There's a difference, right? Um, or a kind of silence, particularly in the face of injustice, right? I don't know of a context or an example where Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was silent in the face of injustice. And and so I think it's quite clear for those of us who understand the sort of theology of Islam to involve or to require involvement, right? Rather than assimilation into a problematic sort of social political structure. Right?
Well, that's I'm going to open up for questions, but in response to that, everyone here is involved in the law somehow. I think some law students are lawyers, and I think our profession is, have this issue of the contrast of social justice reaching toward that, or this idea of the good Muslim or the or otherwise in our legal system is as polite as it gets. I joke, I'm a criminal defense attorney by trade.
Mm-hmm.
We have people that are in big law firms, corporate law. We have people that do legal work for newspapers, government, all kinds. But you won't find a more polite in discussion arena than the law. In fact, there's an ongoing joke amongst criminal defense attorneys that the nicer the judge is to your likely black or brown client, the worse it's going to be when he decides the decision that he's going or she is going to make.
Yeah.
And so I think your point is well taken, not only as members of the Ummah, but also in our trade, which by its very nature of the construction of our government, the judicial branch was required to sign off on any of these racist or white supremacist practices in the past. The violence that occurs through mass incarceration of young black men, or the idea that qualified immunity has been created at our Supreme Court after there were laws that were created in the 1800s because President Grant knew that no police, no government in the South was going to protect Black Americans. And so there had to be a law to say that if you violate these rights, something's going to happen, except for now we know in 2021, unless there is a change in the law, it's not going to happen. And so how do you have any, you're not a lawyer by trade, but is there a way in these polite circles in the law? And I find it, I'm a convert. Obviously I'm white, so I have as much privilege as one can get, and a male at that. How can we be in the system and still maintain our Muslimness in one that's so oppressive? I mean, some of us do jobs that, with their corporate, and it doesn't feel connected to, the people that are really affected by the justice system. We work in it and around it in the courts. What can we do?
That's a very big question. So essentially you're asking me how can I be in it but not of it, right? So there's no if you're going to sort of operate in the public sphere, right? There are very few places that are absent of the sort of legacy of evil. I'm just going to call it evil, right? uh, you know, the institution that I work in for, what have you, right? That's UNC Chapel Hill or academia, more broadly speaking, is in many ways very guilty of some of the same institutional racism that the American legal tradition, the juridical sort of house that we understand, um, that forms the foundation of how we understand the law, right, in this country. I don't know. I mean, so as I was sort of within the past sort of 5 minutes leading up to our discussion, some thoughts sort of entered into my brain, and some of those thoughts are, a person cannot serve two masters, right? And what I want to sort of encourage us to reflect on is, who or what is your legal practice in service of? How is your professional life connected to your theology? What is your theology? And keep in mind that white supremacy is a theology of its own, right? It has its own iconography. It has its own sort of centers of worship, right? It has its own rituals. It has its own performances, right? There's a legal scholar by the name of Khalid Beydoun, who writes about religious freedom, who writes about whiteness as a form of religion. He talks about the difference between formal whiteness, right, as in sort of legalities of how one constructs whiteness, versus substantive whiteness, right, the way in which whiteness gets felt in one's everyday life. That there are certain performances involved in maintaining whiteness. And by whiteness, I'm not necessarily talking about skin color. I'm talking about ideology, right? An ideology that asserts that, or that is invested in white supremacy, right? The notion of a kind of a Eurocentric superiority. I think that if your legal practice is informed through a social justice imperative, or that you sort of remain sort of connected to that principle, that you're closer to the mark in terms of sort of not aligning yourself with a theology of whiteness. That is a kind of a humanistic endeavor that is God-centered, right? Versus centering the law, right? If we understand the law to be something formative of certain practices and performances and this sort of ideology or theology, as I mentioned earlier. And by the law, I'm talking about a kind of an institution-centered manner of thinking that is often not humanistic, but rather aligned to status quo, that is things as they are, that is aligned to the idea of order, as opposed to justice necessarily, right? I think that there's a manner in which the law and justice are not necessarily always commensurate. I mean, I think there's evidence of this, and I think you all would agree with that. Let me know if you don't, and we can talk about it. You're the lawyer, I'm not. But we also, and this is sort of gesturing back to the question of critical race theory, right? But also the question of, I mean, this is not just about theory per se, right? There's a way in which anti-Blackness is death-making, right? There's a way in which the law considers certain, I mean, and we're just going by data, we're just going by not what the law professes to be, or not what the justice system, as some understand it, professes itself to or thinks of itself, but rather how it actually treats the human beings that it whose lives get sort of handled and mangled through it, right? It considers certain bodies expendable, expendable, excuse me. I was thinking fungible. Certain lives expendable, if not fungible, and certain lives sacred, right? The Black radical tradition, right? That is sort of a history of the sort of expansion of civil rights and human rights as a result of the unremitting, unrelenting current of political organizing and social justice activism, right, offers sort of pushed primarily through or by African Americans. It offers us, I think, a generative legacy to think about progression of the law, right? Again, not the law itself, right? Because the law itself is not a kind of an inherently evolutionary or progressive thing, right? But rather it's the people who often find themselves at the mercy of what some refer to as the injustice system, that push the boundaries of how we understand push our understanding. I have pushed our understanding of how we understand justice in the first place, right? Because I think I hope we would agree that the idea that all men are created equal, beyond it being inherently problematic and patriarchal, right, is far and away from the application of equality, right? Furthermore, right, in the context of the sort of historical misapplication or uneven dispensation of rights along lines of race and gender, the misapplication of rights throughout history, right, necessitates thinking about equity, not equality. They're not the same, right? One sort of gives or implies a kind of a fair application of resources and rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that doesn't necessarily consider historical context, that doesn't consider the ways in which people have varying access to the law in the first place, right? We live in a country where people have been given decades, have been incarcerated for decades because they stole a piece of bread or an orange, etc. We also live in a country where someone has been incarcerated or given a sentence of several years for the crime of totally wiping out people's livelihoods due to greed, right? And so certain kinds of corporate white collar crime, i.e. white crimes, versus other kinds of crimes, right, tells us something about the way in which the law is structured in the first place. Just the general language that we use to describe crime in the first place, I think is problematic, at least, from my standpoint, as someone who doesn't practice law, is not, has not had to, pray his way out of a torts class or anything like this. But yeah, I mean, I think that a society, a society is the measure of justice in a society, or rather, back up. Justice can be measured in any given society by how its most vulnerable and marginalized people are treated, or by how its most vulnerable populations are treated and considered.
Yeah, no, and to that, there's so much in all of that, and I want our members to ask questions as we transition to try to get some questions from them. Speaking of just institutionally the challenges, 12% of our country is Black, 5% of our lawyers are Black, 39% of the inmates in the Federal Bureau of Prisons are Black. Black adults, and this is from the federal statistics, the Bureau of Prisons, Black adults are almost 6 times likely to be incarcerated than whites. Currently, 23 states have an all-white state Supreme Court bench, and that's even in 12 states where the people of color are at least 20% of the population. They still have all the seats in the highest courts, which make the final determinations of the law. And so I would love to have anyone chime in with a question if you have them.
Aisha asked, can you say more about the ways in which the ways we talk about crime are a reflection of a lack of equity or equality? Yeah, I mean, that's a big one. And, as I've been saying, I mean, so, I mean, it's everything, right? It's a sort of all-encompassing picture, right? To attempt to explain, and not that you're asking this, but to attempt to explain the way in which our legal tradition, which includes not just the application of law, but the idea of the law itself, in terms of our sort of public attitudes about the law, about the ways in which people are willing to accept the expendability of Black life, right, is part of that tradition, I would argue, right? It's the reason, partly informs the reason why, if a person of African descent commits a crime, that they're way more likely to have their face shown on TV than a white person, right? And by the way, just to sort of sidestep a little bit, not sidestep, but kind of table that, we often talk about the marginalization of Black people, but we don't often talk about the subsidizing of white life, right? The ways in which our public institutions, the federal government, local municipalities participated in building up white privilege, as opposed to, or simultaneously, or concurrently with Black dispossession, right? It's not just a matter of holding Black people back, because that certainly has happened and continues to happen, right? It's that there's a sort of simultaneously holding up of white, particularly the white wealthy folks, right? I mean, granted, yeah, an argument can be made about the sort of disappearance of the sort of middle class, but I think that's also raced as well. I mean, there was a time period in which the federal government was giving away whole swaths of land, particularly in the Midwest, to white families. Or I should say, they weren't just sort of giving away land as if no one was on the land. They sort of first removed the indigenous community, First Nations communities that were there, and then gave that land to poor white folks who were willing to migrate into those sort of Midwestern spaces, just as an example, right? The GI Bill, right? For example, that has been partly responsible for the acquisition of property and wealth, has been differentially applied to white veterans and Black veterans.
Well, economic justice is kind of in a term that I think you're talking about, and we certainly, it seems, and again, I just converted in 2016, but it seems that there's a wealth of
Congratulations.
Yeah, alhamdulillah.
Welcome to our glass house.
Well, it's I'm happy to be here, and it seems like there's plenty of chronic basis for economic justice. We don't have to look far in Islam.
Yeah.
Now, I think Miriam had a question. Can we talk about how Muslim immigrants missed the opportunity to be involved in the Black Muslim community who were here long before we were?
Okay, so we're talking about how Muslim immigrants missed the opportunity to be involved. And yes, please.
Hi, salam alaikum. I think I can probably articulate it better if I kind of give you the fullness of what I'm asking.
Yeah.
So we came here in 1973 from Afghanistan. And, you know, when we got here, we knew that there were Black Muslims. They were called Black Muslims, right? And just like Shia or anybody else, they were just a different kind of Muslim. And we didn't have a mosque anywhere near us. And we didn't go to the Black Muslim mosque. So I feel like this was a natural alliance that could have sprung forth, that was a huge missed opportunity for Muslim immigrants. And I also kind of wanted to touch on how it is or why it is that, you know, our refugees, right, you know, Muslim refugees or asylum seekers are usually sponsored by either Christian, you know, white Christian churches or Jewish organizations, and Black, you know, Muslim organizations haven't done anything around that. You know what I mean? And again, these are natural alliances, Black Muslims, Muslim immigrants, Muslim refugees. And so when you talk about the good, you know, the model immigrant, the story that we're told when we come here is just work really hard, you can live the American dream. And we want to be different from the people that we're told are, you know, lazy, don't work as hard as you do, et cetera, et cetera. So I really wanted to find out where we went wrong. I mean, I don't know if that's part of what you do, but where did we as a society go wrong that we didn't seek you out, you know, or seek the Black Muslims out, and the Black Muslims didn't seek us out?
Well, so let me just backtrack really quick. I would not argue that African American Muslims or Black American Muslims didn't seek to sort of make alliances with the sort of broader Muslim world, right? They have, and they sort of continue to do so. Unfortunately, so at the same time that African American Muslims were engaged in a number of different struggles, right? The struggle to establish their Muslim communities in quite anti-Muslim contexts, the struggle to establish Black religious communities, or, you know, their communities, period, in the midst of Jim Crow, right? At the same time that was happening, two things, right? So number one, there were Muslims already living in the United States that weren't necessarily Black American as well, right? So there's a sort of whole history of sort of Arab Muslims sort of living and dwelling in the United States before the 1960s. It's just that because of the sort of racial categorization that had taken place in the United States, Arabs were sort of invited to participate, were formally considered white, right? And so because of that designation, right, they, as I understand it, many sort of sought to align themselves and live out their lives as if they were white. And whiteness is not just not just a category. It's also, as I said, a theology that involves a set of rituals and performances. So they didn't seek out an alliance with Black Americans. But you do have a whole sort of swath of folks coming from what we understand as sort of Middle Eastern countries and North African countries and African countries, and more broadly, as well as in and around South Asia, who before coming here had already received messages about who Black Americans were through varying forms of American popular media. And those messages were a lie, a mythology, right? That sort of was informed by that theology of white supremacy that we sort of understand as racism. But there's a way in which, right, the baggage that many of folks who were migrating to this country had was colonial baggage, right? Because that's often something that we don't talk about. So those kinds of, that colorism, that sort of racist impulse is something that folks had already sort of baked in because of the respective historical political context where they were sort of coming from as well. And this, I mean, we're talking about like West Africans, East Africans, North Africans, South Asians, sort of Arabs, et cetera. We're all, had their sort of varying understandings and relationships to whiteness, right? Not because they were designated as white, but in terms of participating in the rituals that whiteness asks of people who are sort of coming into the country, in terms of their willingness to participate in anti-Blackness, right? This is not everybody, obviously. There are exceptions, and there are many folks who, when they migrated to the country, found comfort and security in Black American Muslim communities, right? Many examples of this. Also, many examples of, you all have heard of the term white flight. There's also sort of, a manner in which, as Black American Muslim communities were in many cases largely situated in urban areas and adjacent to communities that needed them most, both geographically and politically. Many of those sort of migrant Muslim migrants who were entering the country sought a model of assimilation, right? And were sort of participating in those practices of what we understand as white flight, or a kind of suburban exodus, or planting themselves in suburban locations, hoping to be model minority citizens. Little did they know that whiteness is a zero-sum game. That the notion of purity is a foolhardy endeavor, right? I mean, beyond sort of question of ethnic superiority, which is always informed by a racist impulse, what we can call a satanic impulse, actually, because I mean, this is the first sin that's ever been committed by a created being, is the sin of arrogance, a kind of racism if we think about it, right? Satan declaring that he's sort of made of smokeless fire and thus better than Adam, who was created from mud or earth or black mud. And so, yes, there's certainly a missed opportunity in terms of that alliance, because I mean, no matter how much Muslim migrants supported anti-Black behavior, right? They never were considered part of a sort of general American populace. They were always hyphenated, right? I mean, you had people, I mean, just like certain American Jews who sort of shed their Jewishness in order to sort of disappear into whiteness, you have people who have attempted to do this as well, changing their name from Muhammad to Mo, or, not practicing in public or not practicing at all, or, what have you. Attempting to sort of perform whiteness, I guess. But anyway, there's and I've talked about this in other contexts. What I identify as that missed opportunity to seek an alliance, in my mind, represents a theological chasm. That is a differential, a divergence in how people sort of understand Islam's role in the realm of humanity, right? In certain parts of the American Muslim Ummah, our understanding of knowledge itself becomes a kind of academic exercise. And that is a kind of a theological approach of the privileged. And you have another sort of understanding of what Islam is for in the realm of humanity that goes beyond an academic exercise, but rather is a matter of practicum, right? And this is often a theology that is informed by the underprivileged. I think I'm happy to think through that more, and it's not like a kind of a takfiri approach where I'm sort of rendering certain folks or claiming that certain folks are Muslim and certain folks are not. I'm not doing that. I'm just merely sort of trying to give language to how people understand the Sunnah, how people deploy that term, right? And that can be a very contentious term to use. But so how do we understand the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Do we understand him to be someone who would be okay with sort of building a masjid in a part of the country that seemingly only that is homogenous, right? Both kind of ethnically and economically, or do we understand Prophet Muhammad, his legacy, to encourage us to think about how Muslim institutions must be informed by service, that they must be houses of light and refuge for people who need safety and security, etc. Right? There's a way in which our suburban mosques in the United States don't quite do that. I remember when I was a graduate student, and I was doing a sort of a graduate student intensive at a sort of a Muslim or an Islamic institution of higher learning and research. And we had a very prominent scholar come in. She was a very prominent academic professor. And we were talking about Islamophobia and the topic of sort of anti-Muslim violence and certain kinds of discrimination came up. And she asked a very provocative question, right? She asked, why should Americans who are not Muslim accept Muslims as part of the country? What have they done for their communities that extend beyond, their own, right? It's a hard question to answer, right? And then this is not, to say that Muslim communities don't reach out and don't sort of operate in service of sort of broader humanity, but we are really good at fundraising for folks in Yemen and Syria and Palestine and Pakistan and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we aren't so good at fundraising on behalf of our neighbors, be they Muslim or not, right? How many institutions, I mean, whenever we get money, we build another mosque. We're not as quick to build an orphanage or a homeless shelter, etc. So there's a certain way in which, I mean, the spirit of what she was asking, I mean, she wasn't saying that Muslims don't deserve equal and fair treatment. Let me not be misunderstood. But she was merely just trying to sort of point out a critique about how our Muslim communities form themselves. Yes, mosques are important. Certainly, that's without a doubt. But I think there's a certain manner of institution building that should inform, and the kind of long-term thinking that should inform how we corral our resources and what we devote those resources to, and how we seek to sort of better the societies in which we live, right?
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
please.
and certainly it kind of brings us back to the beginning about critical race theory and these different spheres of being Muslim in America. Until we're joined together, which would necessarily need to be involve listening and understanding of anti-Blackness, it would seem hard to ever go in the right direction, because there's no reflection on, well, how is colonialism or how is white supremacy in our systems affecting me? Because that's all it is. I mean, when you boil it down to, it's about caring about your brother, your sister, and if they're telling you that they're in harm's way and they have been harmed, we should listen. And I would, if anybody else, I've been talking a lot. If anybody else has any questions, would love to have them.
Yeah. I would also like to hear people's voices. Like if you have a question, I prefer
that's
for you
my
to
fault.
ask. Yeah,
I told him to
fine,
text. I agree.
No,
so let's hear some voices.
Yeah. Because I don't sit with the spirit of me having like the answers or any answers, period. I'm just thinking out loud, and I try to ask good questions. That's the only claim I can make. So Miriam, you had some thoughts. Did you want to share that? I don't know if she's still there.
Sister Miriam, her computer just died on me. I'm trying to get her back in. So okay. If anyone else.
There's a thought that I had, but I think I lost it. Oh, well, here's an example, and it kind of it goes both ways too, right? So there's a way in which Muslim immigrants, generally speaking, back in the day, did not seek an alliance with their fellow Muslims when they came to this country, because partly because of all of the sort of lies that they were told about Black folks, the impressions that they had that Black Muslims weren't Muslim or weren't Muslim enough, or weren't knowledgeable, etc. And that also goes the other way as well. Like there's a way in which Black American Muslims were kind of distrustful of their Muslim migrant counterparts because of those often negative interactions, or feeling like, confused about why people sort of could come from the country and claim a certain authority over how to sort of apply Islam in a particular historical political context without consulting the folks that had built the country, right? After all, large, flourishing American Muslim communities get built on unapologetic Muslimness and unapologetic Blackness that seeps from the core of Black American Muslim communities who fought to expand, who partly fought to expand our application of religious freedom to include Muslims in the first place. Yeah, so I mean, we see a way in which, Muslims who are not Black recognize the need to reach out to Black American Muslims. But we saw this mainly immediately after 9/11, where Black American or Muslim communities that were sort of largely non-Black were sort of trying to grasp onto the cultural capital of Black American Muslims. And Black American Muslims were paying attention to that and called that out, and sought to sort of, decrease the size of that rift in the first place. But there's a manner in which that still sort of happens, right? There's in many places, right? Black American Muslims go to certain places and that feel very anti-Black and stop going there, right? A friend of mine who is a doctoral student at Howard University just recently is writing a dissertation about varying forms of Black Muslim expression that occurs at the sort of undergraduate level. And she has this very, very excellent presentation about why are Black students leaving the MSA, right? And she talks about one very interesting example where a prominent majority non-Black Muslim mosque in Detroit fundraised to offer clean drinking water to folks overseas during the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, right? Very, very problematic and very telling about our priorities. Yes, sort of drawing or fundraising to sponsor clean and healthy drinking water for people in other parts of the world is a noble feat. But I think that there's a way in which the inability to see and suffering that's happening right outside your door smacks of a kind of anti-Blackness, right? Never mind the fact that folks in Flint, Michigan are Black and white and etc. But yeah, that offers sort of one example of a kind of a dissonance that's at work, right?
Well, there's a discomfort, to discussing what separates us. But if we can get to, understanding the causes of it, once you get past the initial maybe ownership of seeing some things that we have done, each of these things we've engaged in, not maybe realized it in the front of our brain, obviously, then you can make your own decisions. Like any, knowledge or listening to people, you can decide to get rid of these ways in which white supremacy has separated us all. And that's really it. We can come together if we refuse to accept the marketing that started from the very beginning, that was told to immigrants, the lies that we're still dealing with every day. I mean, there's lawsuits right now for them on critical race theory with the Biden administration that they're trying to argue to get it thrown out. The acceptance of critical race theory has been fought. And so I encourage, obviously I'd love to have some more questions, but I think the key is just to listen and say, I'm not going to have any part of it.
I would also sort of highlight the way in which anti-Blackness is not merely the consequence of white supremacy, right? It is a consequence of white supremacy, but white folks are not the only purveyors of anti-Blackness, right? There's a very sort of trenchant anti-Blackness that occurs throughout the Arab-speaking world as well, right? That folks surely carry with them if and when they come to a country that is has a significant Black population. So that's also, I mean, we talked about like colonial baggage, but yeah, I mean, it's not merely always sort of Euro-colonial domination. there's a way in which that sort of seed of human arrogance sort of inhabits us, that we have to sort of take ownership of. One of the things that white Americans and generally speaking, Muslims who are not Black in this country have in common is a kind of fragility when it comes to talking about race and racialization. I mean, largely speaking, I mean, there are folks who have done great work and on themselves and are invested in expanding themselves and growing to be able to not just talk about race, but to engage in matters of racial justice. I mean, many of us are, if we see somebody call someone else the N-word on the street, we may or may not intervene. Hopefully we do, right? Or you see a kind of a microaggression or a racist interaction on the street, you call it out. But how many of us are willing to do that at our dinner table, right? How many of us are willing to draw those lines in the sand and really be invested in helping and doing one's part to alleviate suffering on the part of people who have been racially oppressed in this country, right? Especially as, and it's weird because it's, I talked with my students about that. I'm just going to keep talking until people have questions.
Yeah, please chime in. You talk over us. There's two people who like talk. Yeah. Just say words.
Yeah, please start shouting, if you have questions. But
can I ask actually something?
Yes, please.
Sorry, assalamu alaikum, Professor Carter. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, you're fine.
I guess kind of, thinking about the world post George Floyd, I think some of us inhabit bubbles where it feels like things have changed a little bit. And maybe they haven't changed enough, and maybe we are in very small bubbles and the rest of the world has actually not changed at all. But just thinking about kind of the American, Muslim community, to the extent you would call it a community, as you said, have you seen any changes or any kind of response that you find encouraging, that you think is at least a step in the right direction, that are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about and implementing in our own community in the DC area?
Yeah, I mean, I'm encouraged when I look at my children. So number one, let me back up really quickly, right? We're not living in a post George Floyd world by any means. One, I think and I'm not saying that you meant any harm, but to use a term like post George Floyd is to imply that he is no longer with us. He is, especially for his family, because they his family has been dismembered, right? So I'm merely saying that so that you don't repeat that if you happen to be in and around his family members. Please don't use that term, because I'm just thinking about, like, if someone were violently taken away from me, I would not want you to use a term that referred to my family member in that way. But the other part of that is that the very machination, the very sort of conditions that allow and produce the killing, the murder of George Floyd are still with us, right? We still are living in the midst of an anti-Black world. Scholars have pointed this out. I mean, racial capitalism is still a thing, right? And there's certain ways in which capitalism, as a sort of undergirding economic framework that we dwell within, is very much tied to racialization. And we cannot really sort of, I mean, this is just my analysis, but I'm not sure that racialization is a thing that we can properly addressed without addressing the ways in which certain capitalist networks are invested in racialization, that they benefit from racialization. I'm encouraged by, you know, certain strides that we've made in Muslim communities, certainly. I think that there's been a manner in which Muslim communities have been made more aware, more self-aware of themselves, right? The ways in which they seem to automatically allied Black folks. I mean, not only are Muslims over, you know, I think racist, and I'm talking about all of, you know, all of us. I don't like see myself as a part of the Muslim community, so that's why I'm saying that, right? And I'm similarly holding myself accountable, invested in the health of our Muslim communities. So that's why I'm saying that. I don't engage in racism. I don't believe myself to be racist. But our Muslim communities, and I use the term communities purposefully, are do express anti-Blackness and can be quite racist. They're also very, very, very classist in ways that are baffling, because the kinds of disparaging of poverty and impoverished people is certainly not informed by any prophetic tradition that I'm aware of, right? I'm talking about in a sort of Abrahamic sense, right? Yeah. So I think I'm encouraged, right? I think it's not great to be pessimistic, although we can quite easily get there. I think that it's some of the folks that I look to for guidance have warned me about pessimism and have warned me about and have called me out on a kind of failing to recognize the work of Allah in the scheme of things, right? To recognize God's work, to recognize that the world is imperfect and it's going to be imperfect and it's that way for a reason, and that we have an opportunity to we can look at it and throw our hands up, right? Or we have an opportunity to attempt to leave this place better than how we found it, and we can all sort of play a role in that. We all play a part in that, right? I mean, you know, so racial justice is active work, right? It begins internally to investigate and interrogate and inventory the ways in which we participate or carry a theology that is not Islamic, right, within us. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, you know, I'm encouraged. But I also am encouraged because I know that Allah is in control. First and foremost, right? Yeah. So there's like what humans do, and then there's what Allah does, right? And Allah can work through certain people to sort of affect change. So yeah, I would say I'm encouraged. Miriam said that you have a self-selecting group. Yeah. I mean, on the face of that, that's true, right? You have people that sort of seek out their kinfolk, and, you know, you want to be able to share certain foods and inside jokes and whatnot. But when it happens to the exclusion of certain folks, right? You know, that becomes problematic. And theoretically speaking, there should be absolutely no mosque that exists on the planet that we should sort of identify as this kind of mosque, right? An Afghani mosque or a Pakistani mosque or a Black mosque or et cetera. Yeah, there's a sort of overwhelming majority in sort of many of these places. But if we understand Islam to be a pathway to God that's been sort of created by God for humankind, then any mosque in which Allah is worshipped should invite any aspect of the human family. So, Miriam, if you can speak, if you here, you can speak, you can just use your voice. You don't have to use the chat. That sort of helps them.
Okay.
And I also prefer your voice anyway than the chat.
Thank you. I just
More human.
my my battery died on my laptop, so I'm on my phone now. But yeah, I think everything that you've said has really resonated with me. You know, we didn't have a lot of Black people in Afghanistan. You know, we have a variety of different colors of people, you know, different skin tones, but not a big Black community. And so we did grow up.
And what do you mean when you say Black? You mean like people of African descent who are sort of sub-Saharan African?
Right.
Darker skinned people? Okay.
Right. I mean, we have very dark skinned people in Afghanistan. And growing up, I was considered, you know, dark, you know, wheat colored or darker than that, which, I mean, we definitely have colorism, you know, I mean, it's a problem to be dark skinned.
Well, then you got Black folks.
Right. But I can see the progress in my family that's from Kandahar. You know, most of the people in my family, even, you know, my aunts, I mean, I'm old and they're older than I am. They're very strongly anti-racist, and my uncles right now, and they talk in terms of anti-racism, and talk about all sorts of other social justice issues that are important in Islam, like, you know, climate change or economic justice or any of the other issues. So I think that whole notion of the good immigrant we're done with that at this point, right? We've been here for 40, 50, 60 years. It's time to get with the program and have these conversations in our own families. And, you know, when your family says something,
that's where the work gets done. Yeah.
Right.
That's where
say,
the
no,
work
that's
gets done.
not, you know, it's, and to also inform people that not being racist is not good enough. You know, and really explaining the difference between just not being racist or whatever you view as racist, and actually being anti-racist.
Right. No, thank you for that. I mean, certainly. So one cannot have a seed of racism in the heart and be a staunch, as I said at the outset, a person cannot serve two masters, right? The idea that one believes in that God is the Most High, the just source of peace, the King, right? The majestic, and there are none like unto him. That is diametrically opposed to the idea that I am greater than someone else because of something inherently within me, right? You find nothing like that in the Quran, right? And so you can't walk on two sides of the street at the same time, right? A movement toward an investment in believing that I am great, especially to the denigration and dehumanization and dispossession and disinheritance of another person or a set of people, right? Moves me away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala automatically. That is the message that we should be receiving in all of our masajid, right? Globally, right? Because the ideology of racism, right? If we're going to call it an ideology, is a counterpoint to an Islamic theology, or a theology of that sort of rests on Islamic monotheism. I mean, again, this is the very thing that got Iblis kicked out of Jannah. So I think we should think carefully about how we think of ourselves if we think we're great, right? And you know, that's a story that I think we should pay more attention to, because there are certain scholars that point to that as this sort of first example of racist thought, right? And this is what critical race theory is. It doesn't talk about it's critical race theory is not it's we need to think about race beyond skin color, right? Think about race as what some folks have called infrahumanism, right? The inherent categorization of people, in which sort of the categorization of people that sort of inheres within it a kind of a schema of value, right? So that certain folks who are at the top of this schema are more valuable somehow inherently than folks who are not at the top of it, right? Either you believe that all human beings have been created by God, and that they are, any one of us is capable of greatness or sort of lowly behavior, right? Or you don't. I mean, this is not me talking. I just is my understanding of being. I mean, I've been Muslim for 20 some odd years. This is the understanding that I have as a result of my study, my reflection, my observation.
Yeah, that's. I mean, reflection has come up a lot. I mean, I would love if anybody else wants to ask a parting question as we wrap up.
If nobody else does, I will. I have more.
Please. I'm gonna sit here and talk to you all day, Miriam.
So,
and everybody else.
Oh my God, I forgot what I was gonna say just now. Oh, it's cognitive dissonance, right? So my people, they don't study the Quran by meaning. They don't know what it means. They've read it from cover to cover, Lord knows how many times, but they don't ever know what it means, because they've never read it in their own language. And so culture is so huge that when you talk about all of these things about Islam, I mean, alhamdulillah, there's nobody that prays more than my mother. I mean, like seriously, she will leave my house. She will leave anywhere. I mean, she will just go and pray. It's like it's the thing for her. I've seen her my entire life, but she's never read. She doesn't know what it means or what it says. So, those conversations are difficult. And I don't know if anybody else has a similar background or experience with their families. So I think that when we talk about what the Quran says versus culture, we are very heavily based in culture. Our Islam is cultural. And the way we practice it is culture. And we're trying now to kind of separate, culture from religion. And that's happened a lot because when you marry outside of your ethnicity, whatever it is, even if that person is Muslim, a lot of us we're at war with our families because of it. They'll disown you. How could you do that? This is so embarrassing. So, it's definitely anti-Blackness, but it's anti everybody who's not us.
Yeah. I mean, that's this kind of a seed of it, right? So, let's see. Yeah, I mean, so there's a sort of scholarly class in the sort of Afghani Muslim context, right? And so even if people aren't reading, the Quran in their own language in order to understand it, right? there should be hopefully some access to scholarship, right? And also like kind of the Islamic legal tradition. But yeah, I mean, what you highlight is true, and actually, there's absolutely no place on the planet that where Islam is practiced by a human being that is sort of absent of the sort of kind of cultural elements that they bring. That's what makes Islam beautiful, because it is the thing inside the human soul that reflects out, and the way in which our souls are sort of composed, the beauty that is within us sort of reflects that light outward. And so the sort of Muslims in Nigeria or in South Africa or in Canada or in Australia, right, that can look differently, and they can have their sort of different cultural sort of elements and practices and whatnot that informs their Islam. But the thing that should be the same is a kind of core theology that recognizes that God is God, and that man is not God. There is no woman that's God. Matter of fact, God doesn't have a gender, right? God is not like the human being. The human being is created, and God is not created, right? And so, yeah, I mean, it can be difficult. And what you talk about in terms of like marrying outside of ethnicity, yes, there is a kind of cultural or ethnic preference that happens. That can result in varying forms of like, I'm not sure if discrimination is the right word. But a kind of insularity, right? That on one face is I guess, I don't want to say right or wrong. It just is what it is. But also it can run counter to the very idea of human equality that is inherent within Islamic doctrine. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you have certain folks that will sort of make a big fuss and to do about these things. I don't necessarily, I mean, granted, I'm married already, but if I were looking to get married, I'm not necessarily like hurt if someone won't, feel some kind of way about me marrying into their family. I'm like, you keep your family to yourself because your family's problematic anyway. So
right.
Thank you.
It takes care of itself, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
If
Exactly.
you let it. I think Lukman, who's our president, I think he may have had a question or two. If he is there.
I am. Sorry, Michelle. I didn't mean to interject and take your question. Professor Carter, first, thank you so much for joining us. It's obviously a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you. Assalamu
alaikum. So my question is actually, so to just give me, I think, bear with me for a couple of minutes. As a Nigerian Muslim who grew up in Lagos, not really knowing or appreciating the fact that I was different by virtue of my skin color. And then immigrating to the United States and finding out that my skin color does matter. And at the same time, growing up in a household where my parents made it clear that I was not African American. You're not Black. Don't wear baggy pants. Don't talk like them. You're different from them. And I feel like a lot of, and it's frankly like it's an immigrant's ethos that's fairly pervasive, and it's not just like a South Asian family. It extends to all families, including African families. So there's this inherent prejudice. It's Black on Black prejudice, and it's quite blatant. And
it goes both ways.
And it goes both ways. Oh my God, it goes both ways. I can't tell you when I was in grade school, and I will never forget this. Shaka Zulu, I got UPN 9. Anyways, this like miniseries on Shaka Zulu came out, and it was just a bit of my existence, because all of a sudden I was a monkey who only, you know, would walk naked and climb trees all day long. So it's, you're absolutely right. It's definitely bilateral. But the reason why I bring up this question is that, like, in American society, there's for a lot of people, there's this monolithism of Blackness. And when I think of Black success, a lot of it is often African success that African Americans identify, but that non-African Americans, you know, i.e. white people, seem to sort of lump together. And that essentially exacerbates that tension that it's already there. And I feel like, frankly, like that tension is existent. It is not, I don't see a lot of scholarship that really like delves into this issue as closely as it should. I'm just wondering, like, what, again, this is an incredibly broad question, but just wanted your thoughts on, I think is just like appreciating just this very two sides of Blackness, and how people can be more aware and conscious of it. If that makes sense. Well, that was extremely serpentine.
It's fine. It's fine. I'll try to string together some thoughts on that. So number one, you rightly point out that Blackness is not, and Black folks are not a monolith, right? Just like white folks are not a monolith, even though the idea of whiteness wants to express this notion that white folks are a monolith. No, they're not. There is certainly a legacy of anti-Blackness that has been existent within African American communities. I mean, we have our own sort of histories of colorism as well, that unfortunately are the result of living within a society that categorizes people according to race and is connected to folks adjacent or not to whiteness, right? And so that has included and has been pointed at people of sub-Saharan African descent, or African descent more broadly, right? While continental Africans were consuming very problematic messaging about African Americans who were purportedly criminals and lazy and what have you, and had dysfunctional families, et cetera, African Americans, as well as Americans generally speaking, were consuming very, very hateful, problematic messaging about Africans as well. That Africans sort of lived in jungles and didn't wear clothes and all of this foolishness. And this is sort of connected to, I mean, there is scholarship that talks about this, some directly, some indirectly. But one of the things that I wanted to point out is that the legacies of racialization in the United States has increasingly been identified as through a framework of colonialism, right? Which is why we have a term like American settler colonialism that talks about the legacy of declaring indigenous, First Nations folks, Indians, as savages, and Africans, whether they be African American or anybody of African descent, as heathens, right? That these sort of mythologies of race have been used to prevent any kind of social, economic, political solidarity that would benefit people who are marginalized socially economically, politically, right? I mean, whenever you see, and there are people who have sort of written about this, but whenever you see sort of certain racial anxiety show up in American history, it's usually connected to some kind of feelings of economic, some paranoia or anxiety about economic marginalization in and around white communities. So we have the race riots or the Red Summer of 1919, right? Right on the end of World War I, right? You have the Wilmington Race Riot of 1898, which is the only sort of coup that we sort of recognize in American history. And when I use the term race riot, I actually mean white mob violence. So I'll just say that, white mob violence, right? You have a burgeoning and sort of successful Black community in and around Wilmington, North Carolina, in the late 19th century that has political representation, and its sort of resident white community decides to engage in white mob violence and run Black folks out of town. And the certain gains that were had in that place have not been seen since in and around Wilmington, North Carolina. Same thing with Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? Same thing, during at the end of Reconstruction, right? When the so-called Great Betrayal, right? The sort of manner in which you see Black political representation has not bounced back from that. Although that has happened, right? What, more than 150 years, however, 150 years prior. So yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that the kinds of anti-Blackness that we see happening in both directions has happened and is happening, unfortunately, in certain contexts, is the result of a kind of colonial ideology, right? On the other side of that, right, you have many people of African descent, whether they be continental or continental Africans or African Americans, educated and networking at historically Black institutions, right? And so the very idea that African Americans were not successful, are somehow like not successful, runs counter to the fact that many Africans, particularly in the sort of early 20th century, were educated at historically Black colleges. Many sort of Western educated elites, as we might refer to them, are actually educated at historically Black colleges. And then some of them sort of seek graduate training at other places as predominantly white institutions begin to desegregate. But yeah, I mean, this happens. I mean, one of the things that I sort of tried to think through that sort of I talk about at the beginning of, I'm pointing to my computer screen. At the beginning of this article that was shared with you is sort of thinking through this question in a class on Black Muslims that I taught at Harvard University, in which I'm sort of trying to think through the legacy and presence of African American Muslim communities adjacent to the legacy and history of Somali American Muslims. I mean, one could do the same with Sudanese American Muslims, Senegalese Muslims, Nigerian Muslims, etc. Right? But it just so happened in the Boston Cambridge area, this is a very sort of sizable Somali Muslim community, right? That is similarly on the receiving end of anti-Black violence and anti-Muslim violence. The only difference is Somali American Muslims have to also contend with ideas about foreign terrorists and extremism and citizenship questions, et cetera. Countering violent extremism programs and funding is sort of leveled at Somali youth in particular in places like Boston, Toronto, Minneapolis, LA, I believe. I mean, coming from different governmental sources, obviously, since Toronto's in Canada, but nonetheless, right? There's this idea or this communication about certain kinds of anti-Black policing that's sort of animated by the myth of Somali gangs and things like this. And folks have sort of written about this. So we were just trying to think about the ways in which this sort of similar experience of race, racial and religious violence pushes together these two communities into what Candace Watts-Smith calls diasporic consciousness. She writes a book called Black Mosaic, the politics of Black pan-ethnic identities, something like that. Anyway, the main title of the book is Black Mosaic. It's by Candace Watts-Smith. Very interesting read, and I can send you some other stuff if you reach out along those lines. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly a legacy of that. One of the things that we're seeing is a kind of emergent recognition of an adoption of a sort of a positive Black identity amongst Black migrant Muslim communities, for lack of a better term, particularly amongst sort of the second generation and their children. So.
Thank you, Lukman. Michelle, do you have a question?
Yeah, and I ask with some hesitation because I feel like I'm not educated enough, so it might be a terrible question. But so I'm Ashkenazi, and so a big issue we have, like in my community, is anti-Blackness that stems from I don't think distrust is the right word, but like not familiarity with conversion, with converts. And so I'm wondering if there's an overlap in the Muslim community, in the US specifically, I think, with anti-Blackness and with view of conversion, especially when, I mean, obviously this isn't true for everyone, but a lot of the major figures you think about when you think about Black Muslims, like Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, like their conversion was a big part of their story of who they were. And so maybe it's not, because I know like the Muslim religion is supposed to be completely accepting of conversion, but I am curious if there is that overlap still.
I would say that's complex. I would say largely, I don't know of any instance in which Muslims, be they sort of largely Arab or South Asian or otherwise non-Black, have any issue with anybody converting to Islam. Now, there's a history of the kind of reception of Muslims who are Black in terms of that they're sort of the manner in which they practice Islam is somehow deficient, in spite of quite clear histories about of successful Black Muslim communities since like forever. It also depends on who's converting, because of the sort of in certain communities where the community that ascribes to the ideology of whiteness, right? I think it's interesting and funny how, someone who is, remember I said before that the Muslim communities are frighteningly classist and problematically have an issue with racism. If you are poor and Black and you convert to Islam, depending on the community you're in, and Black communities, that's much less of an issue. But in, say, a suburban community that's largely middle to upper middle class or upper class, being poor, period, or poor and Black, working class, your reception could be lukewarm. It's a problem. If you are middle class, upper middle class, whatever, or just white, period, and you convert to Islam, your reception is much different. next week you might be giving a sermon. I mean, I'm joking, but I'm also not. There's a certain kind of pass that that white Muslims get. Unfortunately, yes, everybody should be treated and welcomed, treated well and welcomed. I don't have an issue with the positive treatment of white Muslims who have converted to the whatever. That's fine and well and good. The fact that it's animated by what I see as a kind of a colonial mindset is the problem. I mean, in certain communities, you're lucky if you are allowed to call the azan. Never mind serving on the. I mean, you might serve on the board. Yeah, okay. The Muslim community, the mosque has a youth program and basketball is part of it, and so they invite some Black dude to serve on the board in that capacity. I am uncomfortable with any mosque that does not have women, or especially women of color, serving on the board. If there's a mosque that does not have Black women who sort of operate comfortably in that space, I have questions. And that's specifically because due to the issues we have with race and gender in this country, but also how they operate in Muslim communities especially, right? In terms of treatment, they operate at the sort of lower rung in the minds of larger suburban Muslim communities. Because, I have daughters. I mean, beyond the fact that, people need to be treated fairly, period. But I also have daughters who are Black and who are girls, right? I'm not going to feel comfortable letting them be in a space that does not value them, right? In the ways that they need to be valued. Now, with regard to the question of the Jewish community, yes, I mean, there's definitely those sort of complexities with regard to race and religion baked in there, and they're connected, right? I don't think we should attempt to tease out one or the other, right? I mean, there's this idea of a kind of the way in which certain Jewish communities view the world as sort of cleaved in two. You're either Jewish or you're not, right? And that certain preferential treatment occurs along those religious lines. But race is also a part of that. And I don't think can be sort of disentangled from even that idea of sort of an ideology of chosenness. Yeah, I mean, I think that, we just read in my class, we just read a book about Latino Jews in the United States. And that's something that most people don't think about. I mean, I didn't grow up thinking about, like, Latino Jews, what, they got those? But yeah, I mean, if you think about like all of Latin America, right? And where Jewish folks reside, right? They are largely Spanish speaking. They largely would identify or be identified as sort of existing within a Latinx identity to some degree, at least, particularly when they come to the United States, or if they're in the United States and they're of a kind of Latin American parentage or something. I mean, and so there's their experience is very sort of complex and can be dependent upon the community that they're in terms of the kinds of treatment that they get, the kinds of ways in which they are welcomed or not in their own communities. So hopefully I answered your question. Okay.
Well, we have taken you into overtime, Professor Carter, but I would note that through your expression and willingness to share, you've done so willingly. If anybody, I'm going to open them for one last question, if anybody has one. Well,
favorite podcast.
My favorite pod. My favorite
Your
podcast.
right now.
I don't do podcasts. I'm weird. I'm like late to the game. I was late to the game on Twitter, late to the game on Facebook, late to the, I don't use social media really that much anymore, except for like when my wife wants to show me something funny. I'm actually like tapped out of like popular discussions about what's happening in the world today because of it. I don't know. I'm weird like that. New Books in Islamic Studies is a podcast that I think would be my favorite, but that's kind of a nerd thing. I've only listened to like 2 episodes, but they've been great. So yeah.
Well, this is, I really appreciate you coming to speak with us, Brother Carter, and I hope that these discussions continue inside of each of us and outside of us within the Ummah, and that we don't externalize any of this to the greater part of this country or the world, and that we can do our best to change this, because I do believe that a truly united Ummah is something we should at least try to aspire to. And if we're trying to aspire to it, then we have to listen to those who are in pain and address anti-Blackness. So thank you everyone for being willing to ask questions, listen, Professor Carter for sharing, and maybe we just get some time. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you so much. It was my honor and a pleasure to speak with you.
All right. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome.